quiet little town where everyone seemed to know each other's name, there was a small public school sitting on a hill. The kind of place where the paint peeled off the walls and the old piano in the music room hadn't been tuned in years. The teachers did their best, but not everyone treated their students the same way. Some children were favorites, always praised for the smallest things, while others were simply overlooked, like the boy who often sat by himself near the window. He was a quiet child, the kind that most people never noticed walking down the hallway. He didn't talk much, didn't cause trouble, and never seemed to fit in. His clothes were simple, always a bit too big, and his shoes had scuffed edges that told stories of long walks. Yet behind his silence there was a calmness in his eyes that carried more meaning than words ever could. His teachers often misunderstood him. Some thought he was lazy because he didn't speak up in class. Others believed he wasn't smart because he didn't always hand in perfect work. What they never realized was that he was listening, always listening, and observing everything around him. He wasn't the type to interrupt or argue. He just quietly took in the world piece by piece like a sponge soaking up the smallest details. In music class, he would sit in the corner, watching other kids play instruments. The classroom was full of chatter, laughter, and the sharp squeaks of violins being tuned. It was a messy kind of noise, but to him it was beautiful in its own way. The violin especially caught his attention. Every time the teacher lifted the bow and drew it across the strings, a strange warmth filled his chest. It was as if something deep inside him wanted to speak that same language, the language of music, but he never said it aloud. He knew better than to draw attention to himself. The violin class was mostly filled with children whose parents could afford private lessons. They carried shiny instruments in velvet cases, showing them off proudly before practice. The boy didn't have one. His family lived in a small apartment, and his mother worked long hours just to pay bills. A violin wasn't even something they could dream about. One afternoon, while the class was discussing the upcoming school talent showcase, the music teacher asked if anyone wanted to perform. A few hands shot up instantly. The popular kids, the confident ones, started talking about what they'd play or sing. The boy sat still, eyes on his desk, until one of the teachers, half-jokingly, looked at him and said, "Maybe you should play something too. How about the violin?" The class laughed softly. It wasn't cruel laughter, but it had that sting of mockery in it, the kind that leaves a mark even when no one means to. The boy looked up, confused for a moment, unsure if she was serious. The teacher smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind that people give when they don't expect much. "Yes," she added, "that could be interesting. Why don't you give it a try?" For a moment he felt his face grow warm. The whole room seemed to be watching him. He wanted to say no, to shrink back into his chair and disappear. But something inside him wouldn't let him. It wasn't pride or anger, it was something else. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the quiet desire to prove to himself that he could. So with a small nod he said, "Okay." The laughter faded into whispers. The teacher blinked, surprised. "You're serious?" He nodded again. "Yes, I'll try." After class, when everyone left, he walked up to the teacher's desk and asked where he could get a violin. She didn't expect that question. She hesitated, then told him there were a few old instruments in the storage room behind the stage. Most were broken or missing strings, but he could look. He thanked her softly and walked away. The storage room smelled like dust and old wood. Instruments were stacked in corners, trumpets without valves, drums with torn skins, and violins lying forgotten in boxes. He searched through them until he found one. The varnish was chipped and one of the strings had snapped, but when he held it, it felt special, like it belonged in his hands. He carried it home that day as if it were made of gold. His mother was surprised to see him with it. She smiled, though a bit worried. "You're going to play that?" she asked gently. He nodded, placing the instrument carefully on the table. "I want to try for the school show." Her eyes softened. She didn't have money for new strings or a teacher, but she placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "Then try your best." That night, after finishing his homework, he sat on the edge of his bed and tried to make a sound. The first few attempts were awful. The bow screeched across the strings, and the noise was so sharp it made him wince, but he didn't stop. Every night after that, when the apartment was quiet, he would take out the violin and practice. Sometimes his fingers hurt so much that he had to stop, but he always picked it up again. The sound was rough, uneven, but every note taught him something new. At school, no one knew he was practicing. He didn't tell anyone, not even the teacher who had suggested it. Days turned into weeks. One afternoon, while he was practicing alone in the empty music room, an old woman happened to walk by. She was the retired music teacher who used to work at the school. She paused by the door, listening. The sound wasn't perfect, but there was something raw and honest about it that made her step inside. "You're playing that violin?" she asked softly. He looked up, startled. "I'm trying to," he said. She smiled and walked closer. "You're not doing badly for someone who's teaching himself." "May I?" He handed her the violin. She adjusted the bridge, tightened the bow, and played a short, smooth melody. The room filled with sound, warm and rich. His eyes widened. "See?" she said. "The violin has a soul. You just have to listen to what it wants to say." From that day forward, she came to visit him a few times a week after school. She didn't teach him in a strict way, but rather guided him gently. She showed him how to breathe before each note, how to feel the rhythm instead of forcing it. "Music is emotion," she said. "If you're sad, let it sing. If you're angry, let it shout. Don't worry about perfection. Play what's real." Slowly, his playing began to change. The sharp, awkward notes softened into something beautiful. His hands became steadier, his ear sharper. He started understanding how each vibration carried feeling, how every pause had meaning. Sometimes he'd close his eyes and imagine he was somewhere else. A place where no one laughed at him, where music spoke louder than words ever could. At school, a few teachers started noticing that he stayed late. One day, two of them passed by the music room and heard faint music drifting out. They exchanged glances but didn't say anything. Perhaps they were curious, or maybe they thought it was just another student fooling around. But inside that room, something special was taking shape, something no one expected. The day of the talent showcase grew closer. The list of performers was pinned on the bulletin board, and next to all the familiar names, there it was. His name, next to violin performance. Some students raised their eyebrows. A few even laughed quietly when they saw it, but he didn't care. He just smiled and walked away. At home, he practiced until his fingers ached. The old violin had started to sound warmer, more alive. His mother would sometimes pause her work just to listen from the next room. She didn't say much, but every now and then he'd hear her humming along. That was enough for him. The night before the show, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window looking out at the streetlights, holding his violin in his lap. His mentor's words echoed in his mind. "Play what you feel." He didn't know if he'd be good enough, but for the first time in his life, he didn't feel afraid of being seen. He felt ready. When morning came, he carried the violin to school carefully, wrapped in a worn towel because he didn't have a proper case. He walked past other kids carrying shiny instruments and perfect costumes. Some looked at him with pity, others with amusement, but he didn't look back. Deep inside, he knew he had something they didn't. Heart. As he waited backstage that day, the sound of applause for other performers filled the air. His heart raced, his palms were sweaty, and he could barely breathe. But when his name was called, he took a deep breath and stepped into the light. The hall was full. Teachers, students, parents, all watching. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the sea of faces. Some smiled politely, others seemed curious. Then, in that silence, he lifted the bow, placed it gently on the strings, and began to play. When he stood under the lights that day, holding the old violin, everything around him felt distant. The hall was full of noise a moment ago, but now it was quiet enough to hear his heartbeat. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him. His palms were sweating and his fingers trembled slightly. For a second, he thought about running off the stage. He wasn't ready. Maybe he never would be. But then he remembered what his mentor had told him. Play what you feel, not what you fear. He took a slow breath, closed his eyes, and drew the bow across the strings. The first sound that came out wasn't perfect. It was soft, shaky, and uneven. He almost stopped, thinking people might start laughing, but no one did. The hall stayed quiet, so he tried again. The next note came out clearer, then another and another. The sound began to grow. The violin, old and cracked, came alive in his hands. He didn't think about who was watching anymore. He wasn't in the school hall. In his mind, he was sitting by his bedroom window again, the moonlight shining on the strings. He remembered how every night, even when he was tired, he picked up the violin and played until the notes began to sound right. Every emotion he had ever held inside him, Loneliness, hope, and quiet strength started to pour out through his music. The audience leaned in without realizing it. The teachers who once doubted him exchanged surprised glances. Even the students who had teased him felt something shift in the air. The melody wasn't flashy or loud. It was simple, pure, and full of feeling. He played until the very last note hung in the air, trembling softly like a whisper. Then he lowered his bow, opened his eyes, and saw everyone standing still. For a heartbeat, no one moved. And then slowly applause began to spread, soft at first, then louder, until the whole hall was filled with the sound of clapping. The boy stood frozen. He didn't know what to do. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. He just smiled shyly and bowed. The teachers who had once doubted him now looked stunned. The same ones who told him to try the violin as a joke now clapped the loudest. When he walked backstage, his hands were still trembling. He sat down quietly, staring at the violin resting on his knees. It didn't look special, it was still old, scratched, and worn, but to him it was beautiful. The retired music teacher, his silent supporter, found him there. She smiled proudly, her eyes glistening. "You played beautifully," she said softly. "I told you, the violin speaks when you let it." He looked up at her, unsure what to say. "I didn't think they'd like it," he whispered. "They didn't just like it," she replied. "They felt it." That evening, the story of his performance spread quickly. Students talked about it in the hallways. Parents mentioned it to each other after the show, and one teacher even recorded a small clip of his playing on her phone. By the next morning, that short video was being shared on social media. It wasn't filmed perfectly, but the sound of that old violin carried emotion that no camera could hide. People commented things like, "You can feel his heart in every note," and "This is what real music sounds like." But while others were talking, the boy himself didn't know any of it yet. He was just happy that he hadn't disappointed his mother or his mentor. When he reached home that night, his mother hugged him tightly. "I heard you made everyone listen," she said with a proud smile. "I knew you could do it." He placed the violin on the table carefully and nodded. "It felt like the music was coming from somewhere else," he said quietly. "Like it wasn't just me playing." His mother looked at him for a long moment. "That's because when you play with honesty," she said, "it comes from the heart, not just the hands." The next few days at school felt different. The same students who used to tease him now stopped him in the hallway to say they liked his performance. Some even asked if he could teach them a few notes. For the first time, he didn't feel invisible, but not everyone reacted the same way. A few students whispered that maybe he got lucky, or that the teachers were just being nice. Some even said someone must have helped him secretly. He didn't respond to any of it. He just kept going to the music room after school, playing the same old violin, practicing quietly when no one was watching. One afternoon, the principal called him to the office. When he entered, he found two visitors sitting there, a woman and a man he didn't recognize. They introduced themselves as organizers from a nearby city's youth music program. They had seen the video of his performance online. "We were touched by the emotion in your playing," the woman said warmly. "We'd like to invite you to perform at our spring recital next month." He blinked, not sure he had heard right. "Me?" he asked softly. The man smiled. "Yes, you. You have something rare, something people feel when you play. You should share it." The boy didn't know what to say. The principal patted his shoulder proudly. "You've made our school proud," he said. "Go and show them what you can do." That night, when he told his mother, she covered her mouth in surprise. "A city performance?" she repeated. "That's amazing." But he looked worried. "I don't know if I can do it," he said. "I don't even have a proper violin. And there will be so many people there." His mother thought for a moment, then smiled softly. "You don't need a perfect violin," she said. "You just need the same heart that played the first time." The next few weeks passed quickly. The retired teacher helped him prepare, choosing a piece that matched his gentle style. "Don't try to impress them," she said one afternoon as he practiced. "Just be yourself. That's what people connect with." The boy nodded. He practiced every day until his fingers felt raw. But each time the music grew deeper, smoother, more alive. When the day of the recital finally came, he traveled to the city with his mother. It was his first time performing outside of school. The concert hall was huge with tall lights and red velvet curtains that looked like something out of a dream. Dozens of young musicians were backstage, all dressed neatly, their instruments polished and shining. He stood quietly in a corner, holding his old violin wrapped in a soft cloth. Some of the other performers glanced at it curiously. One boy, holding a brand new violin, smirked a little but said nothing. When his turn came, he walked onto the stage. The audience was larger than he had ever imagined, rows and rows of faces stretching out in front of him. He could feel his mother watching from the side, her hands clasped together. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and began to play. The sound that came out this time was richer than ever before. The violin seemed to sing, each note flowing naturally into the next. He wasn't just playing. He was telling a story without words, a story of struggle, of hope, of someone who refused to give up even when the world didn't believe in him. By the time he reached the final note, the hall was silent again. Then, just like before, applause erupted, louder and longer than anything he had ever heard. People stood up, clapping and cheering. He looked out and saw his mother crying softly, smiling through her tears. Backstage, the organizers congratulated him. One of the judges, a well-known violinist, shook his hand. "You have something special," she said. "You play with truth. That's rare." On the way home that night, he sat by the window of the bus, the city lights flickering outside. His violin rested on his lap. He thought about the teachers who had once made fun of him, the laughter that used to echo through the classroom. Now none of that mattered. What mattered was that he had found his voice, and it wasn't through words but through music. When they reached home, his mother turned to him and said, "Do you see now? Sometimes people laugh because they don't understand. But you showed them, you made them listen." He smiled quietly, looking down at the violin. The old wood still had cracks, but now it shone faintly under the light. "I didn't show them," he said softly. "The music did." That night he played again by the window, just for himself. The sound floated gently into the night air, carrying with it the story of a boy who was once mocked for dreaming, but who found the courage to play anyway. He didn't know what would come next. Maybe there would be more performances, maybe not. But deep down he knew one thing for sure. No matter what anyone said or did, the music would always be his. After that night in the city, everything began to change for the boy. The sound of applause still echoed in his mind, but what stayed with him more was the feeling of peace that came with every note he played. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. He was seen, heard, and respected for something that truly came from his heart. When he returned to school the following week, things were different. The same students who used to whisper about him now greeted him with smiles. Some asked questions about his trip, and others wanted to hear him play again. Even the teachers who once doubted him looked at him with new eyes. They spoke kindly now, careful with their words, but he didn't let it change who he was. He still walked through the hallways quietly, still sat by the window in class, still spent his free time in the music room. He didn't care for attention or praise. What mattered to him was the music. The old violin was now a part of him. Every evening he practiced, even when his fingers hurt. His mentor still visited him after school, sometimes bringing sheets of music, sometimes just sitting quietly as he played. "You've grown," she told him one day, smiling. "Not just in skill, but in spirit. You're learning how to speak through your music." He nodded softly, not knowing how to respond. To him, she was more than a teacher. She was someone who saw him when no one else did. Weeks turned into months. One afternoon, while he was practicing alone, the principal came into the music room. "You have a visitor," he said with a smile. The boy looked up, surprised. When he walked out, he saw a man standing near the office. A man in a dark suit holding a violin case. The man introduced himself as a professional musician who had seen his performance at the city recital. "I've been looking for you," he said kindly. "Your music. It's rare to hear that kind of feeling in someone so young. I wanted to meet you in person." The boy listened quietly, unsure how to respond. The man continued, "I run a music foundation in the city. We help talented students who can't afford instruments or lessons. I'd like to offer you a scholarship to train with our teachers." For a moment, the boy just stood there, frozen. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. "You mean, I can learn music professionally?" he asked. The man nodded. "Yes, you have a gift and it shouldn't be wasted." That evening, when he told his mother, she covered her mouth with her hands. "A scholarship?" she whispered. Her eyes filled with tears. "Oh, my child, I'm so proud of you." He smiled shyly, but inside he felt a mix of excitement and fear. It was everything he had dreamed of. But it also meant stepping into a bigger world far away from what he knew. The next few weeks were a blur of preparation. He traveled to the city again to meet his new teachers and visit the music academy. The building was grand with wide hallways and the sound of pianos, violins, and flutes echoing through every corner. It was a world he had only imagined before. The other students were skilled and confident. They came from families who could afford the best instruments and private tutors. He felt out of place at first. His old violin looked dull next to theirs, and his clothes were simpler than everyone else's. But when he played, everything changed. During his first class, the instructor asked each student to perform a short piece. The others played beautifully, but when it was his turn, the room grew silent. He played the same melody he had performed at the school showcase, the one filled with quiet emotion and truth. When he finished, there was no laughter or whispering, only stillness. The instructor nodded slowly and said, "You play from the heart. That's something you can't teach." From then on, he became known at the academy for his unique style. He wasn't the fastest or the most technical player, but his music always carried feeling. It made people stop and listen. He practiced harder than ever, spending long hours in the practice room, sometimes until late at night. His teachers admired his dedication, though some worried he worked too hard. "You must also rest," one of them told him gently. Music lives in silence too, but he couldn't stop. The more he played, the more he discovered himself. Each note told a story, about where he came from, about his mother's sacrifices, about the laughter that once stung but no longer hurt. Back at his old school, stories of his success spread. The teachers who had once mocked him now proudly mentioned his name in assemblies. Some even said they always believed in his potential, though deep down they knew the truth. The boy didn't hold grudges. When he visited his school during holidays, he greeted everyone kindly. One day, he went to the music room and found one of the younger students struggling with the same broken violin he once played. He smiled and knelt beside the child, showing how to hold the bow, how to let the strings breathe. "Don't worry if it sounds bad at first," he said gently. "Every note is a step forward." That small moment meant more to him than any applause. He knew what it felt like to start from nothing, to be laughed at, to be told he couldn't do something. Helping someone else believe they could. That was a different kind of victory. Months later, the Academy announced a national competition. The winner would receive a new professional violin and a chance to perform on television. It was a big opportunity, one that could change his future completely. His teachers encouraged him to enter. He hesitated at first. Competitions made him nervous. He didn't like being compared to others. But then he remembered how far he had come, how each challenge had led to something beautiful. So he decided to try. For weeks he practiced endlessly. His mentor visited him and listened carefully as he played. "You don't need to be the best," she said softly. "You just need to be true." That's what people remember. The day of the competition arrived. The stage was larger than anything he had seen before. The crowd was filled with music lovers, judges, and families. He could see the cameras, the bright lights, and hear the quiet hum of the audience waiting. He stood backstage holding his violin tightly. He thought of his mother sitting somewhere in the crowd and of his younger self, the boy who once sat alone in a dusty music room, scared but determined. He took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. When he started playing, the hall fell into silence. Each note flowed naturally, filled with warmth and honesty. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was simply telling his story. The laughter, the loneliness, the small victories. The music carried everything he had ever felt. When the final note faded, there was a moment of stillness before the audience erupted in applause. Some people even stood up. The judges looked at each other, moved. One of them wiped away a tear. When the results were announced, his name was called as the winner. He couldn't believe it. The crowd cheered as he walked onto the stage to receive his award, a new violin shining under the lights. He held it gently, almost afraid to touch it. Later, in the quiet of his room, he placed the new violin next to his old one. The contrast was striking, one bright and polished, the other scratched and worn. But he smiled softly, knowing both were equally precious. One represented where he started, the other where he was going. That night he called his mentor. "I won," he said quietly. "I knew you would," she replied with pride. You didn't just win a competition, you won respect, and that's worth more than anything. As he hung up the phone, he sat by the window once again, looking out at the city lights. The world suddenly felt wider, full of new possibilities. But deep inside, he knew he'd never forget the beginning, the laughter, the dusty storage room, the broken violin that first gave him hope. He realized something then. Every challenge, every insult, every lonely moment had shaped the music he played. Without them, his sound wouldn't have carried the same heart. And though people now saw him as a rising star, he still felt like the same boy, quiet, humble, and in love with the sound of strings meeting the air. He lifted the old violin one last time that night and played softly into the darkness. It wasn't for an audience, not for applause, not for awards. It was simply for himself, a reminder of how far he had come, and how music had turned pain into strength, and silence into a beautiful song. The next morning after the competition, sunlight poured softly through the window of his small apartment. The boy woke up slowly, still feeling as if the applause from last night hadn't ended. His new violin lay beside him on the table, shining like a piece of his dream made real. He reached out to touch it, still half expecting it to vanish when he blinked. His mother came into the room, smiling quietly. "You didn't sleep much, did you?" she asked, her voice gentle. He shook his head, smiling back. "It still doesn't feel real," he said softly. "All those people clapping. I didn't think I'd ever see something like that." She sat beside him and looked at the instrument. "You earned every bit of it," she said proudly. "Remember where you started? That old broken violin, the one from the storage room?" He nodded. "I still have it," he said, glancing toward the corner where it rested. "I could never throw it away. That's where everything began." His mother smiled wider, her eyes glistening. "You turned their laughter into applause," she whispered. "That's what real strength looks like." The boy looked down at the violin again, thinking of how far he had come. Every struggle, every late-night practice, every doubt, it all led to this moment. But deep down he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, his life began to move faster than ever. The music academy where he studied shared the news of his win on their website, and soon local newspapers picked it up too. The story of the quiet boy who learned violin on a broken instrument spread across the city. Reporters started calling the academy, asking for interviews. At first, he was shy about it. He didn't know how to talk about himself. But people loved hearing his story, not because he was famous, but because his journey felt honest. He never talked about fame or talent. He talked about patience, struggle, and hope. During one interview, a reporter asked, "How did you feel when those teachers made fun of you back in school?" He paused for a moment before answering. "I don't feel angry," he said calmly. "If that hadn't happened, maybe I wouldn't have tried to play at all. Sometimes life pushes you in strange ways. You just have to keep moving forward." That simple answer made people respect him even more. Many who watched the interview online said his kindness was more powerful than his music. Meanwhile, his mentor, now growing older, watched proudly from her small house on the edge of town. She still kept a photo of him on her piano, from the day he first learned how to hold the bow correctly. When he visited her one weekend, she told him, "You've become what I always knew you could be. But don't forget, music isn't about perfection. It's about truth. Always stay close to that." He promised her he would. Months passed and his scholarship opened new doors. He was invited to play at events, small concerts, and even charity galas. Each stage felt different, but one thing never changed. His heart always beat faster before the first note. No matter how big the audience was, he still felt like that same boy standing in front of his classmates for the first time. At one charity concert, he performed in front of hundreds of people, including some of the teachers from his old school. They had come with other staff members, not expecting to see him there. When they saw him step on stage, their faces froze in surprise. The lights dimmed and the audience quieted down as he began to play. The melody he chose wasn't loud or complicated. It was soft and emotional, full of memories. Every note seemed to tell the story of a child who had been laughed at, who had struggled but who refused to give up. One of the teachers who had once joked about him felt tears sting her eyes. She whispered to the person next to her, "That's the boy I told to play violin as a joke. And now look at him." When the music ended, the applause was thunderous. The teachers stood with everyone else clapping as hard as they could. But inside, their applause was mixed with guilt. They realized how unfair they had been, how easily they had judged someone based on appearance and silence. After the show, one of them approached him nervously backstage. "You probably don't remember me," she began awkwardly. I was one of your teachers," he smiled politely. "I remember you," he said softly. She looked down, embarrassed. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for the way I treated you." "I was wrong." He hesitated, then nodded gently. "It's okay," he said. "Maybe things had to happen that way. It made me stronger." She looked at him with watery eyes. "You're a remarkable young man," she said. "I hope you know that." He thanked her quietly, but when she left, he stood there for a while, thinking. He wasn't angry. He didn't need revenge or pride. What he felt was peace. He had proved something far bigger than anyone could see. Not long after that concert, something incredible happened. A famous orchestra from another country reached out to the music academy. They had seen his story online and wanted to invite him for an international exchange program. He would travel abroad, study under world-class musicians, and perform in some of the biggest concert halls. The day he got the news, he ran home to tell his mother. She was folding laundry when he burst through the door, almost breathless. "They invited me to perform overseas," he said, his voice shaking with excitement. His mother froze, the clothes slipping from her hands. "Overseas?" she repeated, smiling in disbelief. "Oh my goodness," he nodded, still catching his breath. "I don't even know how to feel," he admitted. "It's so far away. But they said it's a chance to learn more, to grow." She hugged him tightly. "You've worked for this," she whispered. "Go see the world. Let them hear your music." A few weeks later, he found himself on an airplane for the first time. As he looked out the window, watching the clouds drift below, he thought about his journey. Just a few years ago, he had been a quiet boy with a broken violin and no one who believed in him. Now he was flying across the world because of the same instrument. When he arrived at the new city, everything felt different. The language, the streets, the people. But music, he soon realized, was a language that needed no translation. When he played during his first rehearsal with the orchestra, the other musicians smiled and nodded in admiration. They didn't need words to understand what he was saying through the violin. His performance at the international concert was magical. The hall was filled with people from different countries, all listening silently as he played. Each note carried the echo of his past. The laughter of classmates, the dusty storage room, the sound of his mother's voice encouraging him late at night. When he finished, the applause was thunderous once again, but this time, it wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been told they couldn't do something. His story became a symbol of hope, showing that even the smallest spark can light a fire that reaches the world. After the concert, as he walked back to his hotel, he felt calm. Fame didn't matter. Awards didn't matter. What mattered was that he had stayed true to who he was. He had turned pain into purpose and doubt into music. That night, before going to bed, he wrote a letter to his mentor back home. He wrote, "You once told me that music is emotion, not perfection. I understand that now. Every time I play, I think of those words. You were right. It's not about how loud the sound is, but how deep it touches the heart. Thank you for teaching me that." He placed the letter in an envelope, planning to send it the next morning. Then he sat by the window, his violin resting beside him, and thought about his old school, his small apartment, and his mother waiting back home. No matter how far he traveled, he knew his roots would always be there. The same quiet town, the same dusty classroom, the same boy who once decided to play the violin, not to prove anyone wrong, but to discover who he was meant to be. As he drifted to sleep, the city lights outside flickered like stars, and he realized something beautiful. Sometimes the very thing that begins as a joke, a challenge, or a moment of cruelty can become the reason someone finds their greatest strength. Years had passed since the boy had first picked up that broken violin from the storage room. The world had changed around him, and so had he. What once began as a moment of mockery had turned into a story that inspired thousands. But even after performing on grand stages and traveling to places he never dreamed of, he remained the same gentle, humble person he had always been. Now in his mid-20s, he returned to his hometown for the first time in years. The streets felt smaller, but the memories grew larger with every step he took. His mother still lived in the same little apartment with the worn-out couch and the faded curtains. When she saw him at the door, her eyes filled with joy and disbelief. "My boy," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You're home." He smiled and hugged her tightly. "I told you I'd come back," he whispered. "I just needed time to finish a few things." The house still smelled like fresh bread and old wood. His violin case rested on the small kitchen table as if it belonged there. That evening, as they ate together, his mother asked him, "What made you come home now?" He looked thoughtful. "I've played in so many places," he said. "But I realized something. No matter how far I go, this is where my story began. I want to give something back." The next day, he went to visit his old school. The building had changed a little. The paint was brighter, the classrooms newer, but the memories were still the same. The sound of children running through the halls brought a smile to his face. When he entered, one of the teachers recognized him and hurried over. "It's really you," she exclaimed. "We've seen you on TV performing all over the world." "I can't believe you came back here," he laughed softly. "This place taught me more than I realized," he said. "I thought I'd visit, maybe even talk to the students." The principal, who had once been his music teacher's assistant, quickly arranged a small assembly. Word spread fast through the school. "A world-famous violinist is coming to speak," the students whispered excitedly. When he stepped on stage that afternoon, the sound of applause filled the hall. He smiled, looking at the sea of young faces in front of him, children full of energy and dreams, just like he once was. He began, "I used to sit where you are right now. I wasn't confident. I didn't talk much. And when someone told me to play the violin, it wasn't because they believed in me. It was a joke. But I picked up that violin anyway." The children listened quietly, their eyes wide. He continued, "I didn't know anything about music back then. I just knew I wanted to prove to myself that I could do something beautiful. Every time someone laughed, I practiced harder. And one day those same people clapped for me, not because I was perfect, but because I didn't give up." He lifted his violin case and slowly opened it. The room went completely silent. Then he began to play. The melody was simple, soft, heartfelt, and full of emotion. It wasn't a show-off piece, but a song of memories. The sound filled the hall like sunlight pouring through a window. Every note seemed to tell a story, the pain, the hope, the patience. When he finished, no one moved for a moment. Then the hall erupted in applause. The children stood cheering and clapping with shining eyes. Some of the teachers even wiped tears from their faces. After the performance, a little boy came forward shyly. "I want to learn violin too," he said, "but we don't have one at home." The young man smiled kindly. "I didn't have one either," he said. "But don't let that stop you. Come by the community center tomorrow. I'll be there." That evening, he spoke to the school about starting a free weekend music class for kids who wanted to learn but couldn't afford instruments. The principal was thrilled and immediately offered support. The idea grew quickly. Within weeks, the local community helped gather old violins and donations. On the first day of the class, more than 20 children showed up. Some had tiny violins borrowed from neighbors. Others had only notebooks and pencils, hoping to learn something about music. He started by showing them how to hold the bow, how to feel the rhythm, and how to listen, not just to the notes, but to what they felt inside. Music is not about being fast or loud, he told them. It's about being honest. One of the girls struggled to make a sound that didn't squeak. She grew frustrated and put the violin down. He walked over and knelt beside her. "You hear that noise?" he said gently. "That's how it starts. Every wrong note brings you closer to the right one." The girl smiled weakly, picked it up again, and tried once more. This time it sounded better. As days passed, his little class began to grow. Parents came to listen. People who had never cared for classical music started attending the small weekend gatherings, just to watch the children play. Slowly, the sound of violins filled the neighborhood with something it hadn't felt in a long time: hope. One evening, as he packed up his things, his mother came to the center with food. She watched the children,